She had nothing. He had everything. And somehow, a single loaf of bread made him realize he'd been missing the only thing that mattered. Lydia Mercer lived inside a hole in the ground, and that's not a metaphor. A real hole. Dirt walls, a clay oven, and a door that barely kept the Nebraska wind from taking everything she owned. Nobody came to see her. Nobody asked if she was okay. She was 25 years old and had already made peace with the idea that life had forgotten her name. Then a stranger bought her bread and refused to forget her. If this story already has you curious, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit back, because what happens next is going to stay with you for a long time. The first thing most people got wrong about Nebraska was thinking it was empty. It wasn't empty. It was just honest. There were no trees to hide behind, no hills soft enough to lie about what the land actually was. The sky sat on top of you like a lid on a jar, and the grass went in every direction until it blurred into the horizon and disappeared. In summer, the heat came off the ground in waves that made the distance shimmer. In winter, the wind came down from the north like it had a grudge. And if you stood still long enough out there, the land would tell you the truth about yourself, whether you wanted to hear it or not. Lydia Mercer had been standing still for 3 years. She had come to the Nebraska frontier at 22, following a plan that had belonged to someone else. A father who had believed in the promise of homestead land, a future built on soil and stubborn work. He had drawn the whole thing out on a piece of brown paper one evening at the kitchen table back in Ohio, his finger tracing imaginary fence lines while Lydia and her younger brother watched. The plan had been careful and detailed and full of the kind of confidence that men carried in those days like a second skin. Her father died of a lung infection the following spring before they even crossed the Missouri River. Her brother turned back at the Nebraska border, said he was going to find work in St. Joseph, and never wrote. Lydia kept going. She wasn't sure later whether that had been bravery or simply an inability to picture anything else. She had packed the wagon herself, learned to read the landmarkers from a dog-eared guide she'd traded a jar of preserves for at a trading post, and eventually found the plot her father had registered. 160 acres of flat, unforgiving grassland, 40 minutes outside a small town called Harlan Creek. There was nothing on it, not a single structure. She built the dugout with a neighbor's help, an older Swede named Gunnar who lived 3 miles north, and who came not because he liked her particularly, but because that was how things worked out there. You helped because someday you'd need help back. He showed her how to cut into the hillside at the right angle, how to shore up the walls with timber and sod, how to keep the ceiling from collapsing when the rain came heavy. It took 11 days. When Gunnar left, Lydia stood at the entrance of what was now her home and looked at it for a long time. It was about 14 feet wide and 12 feet deep. The ceiling was low enough that she had to be careful not to stand up too fast. The floor was dirt. The one window was a small rectangle of greased paper that let in a gray, watery light. She carried her things inside, put her mother's quilt on the narrow cot in the corner, and did not cry. She had given herself permission to cry exactly once, on the night she buried her father in a cemetery outside Council Bluffs, with only a Methodist minister and a woman she'd never met standing at the graveside. She had used that permission then, and did not intend to spend another one. Instead, she worked. The clay oven was her own idea. She had no memory of reading about it anywhere, no instruction from anyone. It had come to her one morning in her first autumn, when the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight, and she woke up with her breath making small clouds in the air above her face. She had looked at the corner of the dugout and thought, heat. I need to hold heat. She spent 4 days building it, mixing Nebraska clay with dry grass and sand, the way something in her hands seemed to already understand, shaping the dome in careful layers, letting each layer dry before adding the next. She burned test fires inside it until she could read the temperature by the color of the flame and the smell of the smoke. The first bread she baked in it came out wrong. The bottom burned and the inside stayed raw, and she ate it anyway because she had nothing else. The second loaf was better. By the 20th loaf, she had figured something out that she couldn't fully put into words. A feeling in her palms when the dough was right, a sound the oven made when it had reached the temperature she needed, a particular smell in the air just before the crust turned the color of honey. She baked bread the way some people played music, not just following instructions, but listening. By the time Lydia was 25, she had established a small but steady arrangement with Marcus Webb, the owner of the Harlan Creek Mercantile. Marcus was a heavy-set man with a red face and the careful, measuring eyes of someone who had spent 30 years deciding what things were worth. He wasn't unkind exactly. He just had no tolerance for anything he considered sentimental. He dealt in facts, prices, quantities, trade values. The first time Lydia had walked into his store with a wrapped loaf of bread and proposed that he sell it for her, he had looked at her the way you look at someone who doesn't quite understand how the world works. "I sell dry goods, Miss Mercer," he said. "Flour, sugar, salt, not bread." "You sell whatever people will buy," she said, "and people will buy this." He stared at her. She put the loaf on his counter and unwrapped it. The smell alone made two customers near the back of the store look up from what they were examining. Marcus cut a thin slice, ate it slowly, and spent a long moment looking out the window at the street. Then he looked back at her. 40%, he said. 30. Another pause. 35. Done, she said, and they shook hands across the counter. She had been supplying him for almost 2 years now. 3 to 5 loaves a week, depending on her flour supply, carried the 2 miles into town in a basket covered with a clean cloth. The money was not enough to call comfortable, but it was enough to keep her fed through the winters when the garden froze and the money from odd sewing work dried up. It was a life, thin and stripped of almost everything people usually meant when they used that word, but hers. The morning Caleb Hart bought her bread was a Tuesday in late September, which was the kind of day that made you understand why some people loved Nebraska and why others lost their minds there. The sky was that particular blue that only existed for about 3 weeks in autumn, so clear and deep it almost hurt to look at, the kind of blue that felt like a promise the land had no intention of keeping past November. The air smelled of dry grass and distance. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone yellow, and their leaves made a dry, papery sound in the wind. Lydia had been in town since early morning. She'd dropped her bread at the mercantile, collected her share from the previous week's sales, bought flour and a small tin of lard, and was making her way back to her wagon when she heard Marcus Webb's voice behind her, sharp and carrying. "Hart! Caleb Hart, you're tracking mud across my clean floor." She didn't turn around. She had no particular reason to. She climbed up onto her wagon seat, clicked to her old gray mare, and drove back out of town the way she had come, the wooden wheels rattling over the ruts in the road. Caleb Hart had been ranching the land south of Harlan Creek for 6 years, and he was 31 years old, and most people in the county would have described him the same way if you asked them: steady. That was the word they always landed on. Not exciting, not particularly warm, not a man who filled a room when he walked in. Steady. The kind of man you trusted with a handshake because he had never once given you a reason not to. He had arrived in Nebraska at 25 with a small inheritance, a tolerance for hard work, and the kind of patience that came from growing up in a house where the wrong word at the wrong moment could turn an evening bad in ways that lasted for days. He had bought a failing cattle operation from an old rancher moving back east, spent the first 3 years working until he could barely stand, and now owned 900 acres and a herd that other ranchers mentioned with a kind of reluctant respect. He had a ranch house, 2 hired hands, a dog named Chester, and nothing that felt like a home. He wasn't unhappy, exactly. He had been raised to understand that contentment was something you earned through discipline and work, and that wanting more than what you had was a kind of weakness. He had accepted this idea for years the way you accept a fence line, not because you particularly love it, but because it's there and you've stopped noticing it. He had come into the mercantile that Tuesday for salt and fence wire. He was walking toward the counter when the smell hit him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing he could have described well in words. It was just bread. Fresh bread. The smell of it in the air of the cluttered store, warm and yeasty and faintly sweet, was so specific and so unexpected that he stopped walking. He stood in the middle of Marcus Webb's store for a full 3 seconds, which was long enough for Marcus to appear at the counter and give him an irritated look. "You're tracking mud." "Sorry." Caleb moved to the mat near the door, scraped his boots, and came back. "What's that smell?" Marcus glanced at the counter behind him, where 2 loaves sat wrapped in cloth. "Bread. Woman brings them in most weeks. Sells faster than I'd have thought." Caleb looked at the loaves. "Who makes them?" Marcus pulled one toward him and began wrapping it properly for sale. Mercer woman. Lives in that dugout east of the creek. Keeps to herself mostly. Mercer. Lydia Mercer. Father was going to homestead out here. He passed. She stayed on. Marcus said it the way you'd state a fact about weather. Without judgment, without particular interest. You want one? Caleb had not planned to buy bread. He had 2 hired hands who ate their meals at the bunkhouse and a cook arrangement with an older woman in town who sent food out twice a week. He didn't need bread. Yeah, he said. I'll take one. He ate it that evening, sitting on the porch of his ranch house, with Chester sprawled across his boots. He had cut a thick slice, the way you do when you're not expecting much, meaning to eat it quickly and get back to the account books he'd left on the table. He didn't get back to the account books for a long time. There was something wrong with the bread, or rather, there was something wrong with his response to it. It tasted like bread. That was the maddening part. He couldn't point to anything unusual about it, couldn't identify some specific ingredient or technique that made it different. It was simply bread, but made with a kind of care that changed what the word meant. It was the difference between a song played correctly and a song played by someone who actually felt it. He sat on that porch until the light went and ate most of the loaf before he noticed what he was doing. Chester watched him with the focused interest of a dog who understands that food is being eaten nearby and has opinions about this. Don't look at me like that, Caleb said. Chester sighed and put his chin on Caleb's knee. Caleb looked out at the dark prairie and thought about a woman living in a dugout east of the creek who somehow knew how to make bread that made you feel, for a few minutes, like everything was going to be all right. He didn't know what to do with that feeling, so he did what he always did with things he couldn't categorize. He ignored it for a few days and waited to see if it went away. It didn't. The following Saturday, he went back to the mercantile. There was 1 loaf left, and he bought it without hesitating. He asked Marcus more questions this time, the way you do when you're trying to make curiosity sound like small talk. This Mercer woman, she been out here long? Marcus was sorting bolts of fabric, not particularly interested. 3 years, give or take. Came with her father. Like I said, he didn't make it. She live alone out there? Far as I know. Caleb picked up the loaf and turned it over in his hands. The crust was perfect, even color, just the right give when he pressed it gently with his thumb. She sell anything else? Just the bread. Marcus looked up briefly. Why? You developing an interest in baking, Hart? Just curious. Marcus gave him the look of a man who did not believe that answer, but was too busy to pursue it. She keeps to herself. I don't know much about her beyond the bread. Caleb paid and left. He asked other people over the next week, casually, carefully, the way he handled everything, without urgency, without revealing what he was actually trying to find out. He asked Doris Halverson at the post office, who knew everything about everyone in Harlan Creek, and who told him that Lydia Mercer received very little mail and that her father's death had been a terrible thing, and that the girl was too stubborn for her own good, living out there alone like she had something to prove. Does she have family anywhere? Caleb asked. A brother, I think. In Missouri somewhere. Doesn't write. He asked Pete Garfield at the feed store, who shrugged and said he thought the woman was probably a little odd, no offense meant, and that he'd heard she'd turned down help from the church committee twice, which Pete considered a bad sign. He asked old Gunnar Lindqvist, who had helped her build the dugout, and Gunnar looked at him with sharp blue eyes and said simply, She works harder than most men I know. Doesn't complain. Why? Just heard about her, Caleb said. Gunnar continued looking at him for a moment before turning back to whatever he was doing. She doesn't need people feeling sorry for her, he said, if that's what you're working up to. It's not, Caleb said. He wasn't sure at that point what he was working up to. The dugout was not hard to find if you knew where to look. East of the creek, past the bend where the cottonwoods grew thick, up along a low hillside that barely deserved the word, the entrance was cut into the slope and framed with dark timber, and there was a small clay chimney poking out of the ground a few feet back from the door and a garden plot beside it that had been put to bed for winter, the soil turned dark and even in neat rows. There was a wagon out front, a gray mare tied to a post, head down, pulling at the dry grass around it. Caleb sat on his horse for a moment at the bottom of the slope and wondered what exactly he thought he was doing. He had ridden 40 minutes from his ranch. He had no good reason to be here that he could explain to another person. He was a grown man who had spent the past 2 weeks asking half the town about a woman he had never met because she made bread that he couldn't stop thinking about. He thought about turning around. He heard, from behind the dugout door, a sound he recognized after a moment. Someone humming. A low, unself-conscious sound, the kind people made when they were alone and didn't know they were doing it. He dismounted, tied his horse next to the mare, and knocked on the door. The humming stopped. A pause. Footsteps. The door opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was not what he had expected, which he understood immediately was because he hadn't known what he expected. She was about his height, which surprised him. He'd built some vague image of a small, fragile person from all the cautious pity in people's voices. Her hair was dark and pulled back roughly, a few strands loose around her face. Her eyes were brown and sharp, and currently looking at him with an expression that was not quite hostility, but was definitely not warmth. She had flour on her left forearm and a wooden spoon in her right hand. "Can I help you?" she said. Not unfriendly, but not particularly friendly either. "I'm Caleb Hart," he said. "I ranch south of town." "I know who you are," she said. That surprised him. "You do?" "Harlan Creek isn't very big, Mr. Hart." She didn't move from the doorway. "What do you need?" He had planned on the ride over to say something about admiring her work, or perhaps something about the bread specifically. Some reasonable, sensible explanation for showing up unannounced at a stranger's home. Now, standing in front of her with the actual words required, he found that none of the sentences he'd rehearsed felt honest enough to say out loud. "I bought your bread," he said. "Both loaves that Webb had. I wanted to see where they came from." She looked at him for a moment. "You rode 40 minutes to look at a bread oven." "No," he said. "I rode 40 minutes because I couldn't figure out who made something that good, and it was bothering me." She studied him the way you study a fence line to find where it's weak. Then she stepped back from the door, not exactly inviting him in, but creating enough space that the invitation was implied. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, "but you can come in if you want to stand in a corner and not be in the way." He stood in the corner. The dugout was smaller than he'd imagined and better organized than he would have believed possible given the space. Everything had a place and everything was in it. The tools on their hooks, the jars in their rows, the blankets folded precisely on the narrow cot. The floor was swept dirt, hard-packed and clean. The ceiling was low enough that he felt the instinct to duck even where there was technically room. And against the back wall, taking up nearly a third of the space, was the oven. He had expected something rough. What he saw was a structure that looked almost deliberate in its precision. A clay dome that rose from a curved base, the surface smooth and dark from years of use, the opening at the front shaped in a careful arch. A small fire burned inside it, the orange light flickering against the clay walls. "You built that yourself?" he said. "Yes." She was at this rough table in the center of the room, working dough with both hands, not looking at him. "How?" "Looked at a few adobe walls once, read what I could find, made it up as I went." A pause, hands still working. "First version collapsed, second one holds." "What happened to the first one?" She glanced at him briefly. "I knocked it down and started over." He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the oven popped softly. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in that low, constant way it did out on the plains. Not a sound, exactly, more of a feeling. "Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked. "Going somewhere easier?" She stopped kneading and looked at him directly, and it was the first time she'd done that since he'd come inside, and the look was not aggressive, but it was serious in a way that made him feel like the question had weight he hadn't entirely intended. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "Same way you think about things you've already decided not to do." She went back to the dough. "This land was my father's plan. I stayed to find out if it was mine too." "And is it?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "I don't know yet." He stayed for almost 2 hours. He wasn't sure how that happened. One moment he was standing in the corner feeling awkward and aware that he'd created a strange situation by coming here at all, and then somehow they were talking. Not about anything significant at first. The weather, the way the autumn had come in fast this year, the price of flour, which had gone up at Webb's store, and which Lydia said with a flat practicality that suggested she had already calculated exactly how it affected her margins. She was direct, not rude, but completely uninterested in softening things with politeness. When he said something imprecise, she corrected him without hesitation. When she disagreed with him, she said so without the kind of careful hedging that most people used, especially women talking to men they didn't know. He found himself paying attention in a way he usually didn't bother with. At some point, she pulled a small, misshapen loaf from the oven, a test batch, she said, for a new flour ratio she was trying, and cut it into pieces without asking him if he wanted any. Just put a piece near him on the table the way you'd put water out for a visitor. He ate it. The crust crackled exactly right. The inside was denser than her usual loaves, slightly different flavor from the changed ratio, and even in this rougher form, it had that quality he couldn't name, something made with actual attention. "This is different," he said, "more rye than usual. I'm trying to make it last longer through the cold. The wheat goes stale faster." She was looking at the bread critically, tearing a piece and chewing it slowly. "It's too heavy on the bottom. I need to adjust the heat distribution." "It tastes good." "Good isn't the goal," she said. "Good enough for what I need it to be is the goal." She set the piece down. "Good enough to sell. Good enough to last. Good enough to make it to spring." He looked at her. She was already turning back to the oven, checking something inside it, adjusting the damper with a practiced hand. He thought about the word enough and how differently it sounded when you said it the way she did. Not as a settling for less, but as a very specific and serious thing you were working toward with all of yourself. Before he left, he asked if he could come back. She looked at him again with that measuring expression. "You going to keep buying my bread?" "Yes." "Then there's no reason you'd need to come out here." "I'd like to see how the rye loaf turns out," he said. A pause. The fire popped. Chester, who had tied himself in a philosophical knot waiting outside, made a sound of impatience that Caleb could hear through the door. "Come on a Thursday," Lydia said finally. "I bake Thursdays." He came on Thursday. He came on the Thursday after that. He came on a Tuesday once when he'd been out riding the eastern fence line and the route had taken him close enough that not stopping would have felt deliberate. He knocked on the door and she opened it and looked at him and said, "It's not Thursday." And he said, "I know, I was nearby." And she stepped aside and let him in. The town started talking because the town always started talking. Harlan Creek was the kind of place where patterns got noticed. A man like Caleb Hart, steady, established, someone whose movements meant something, riding east of the creek on a Tuesday didn't go unobserved. Doris Halverson mentioned it to Martha Gaines at the dry goods store. Martha mentioned it to her husband. Her husband mentioned it at the barber shop. Within 2 weeks, the general shape of the thing had been assembled by the community through the usual method of half observations and confident guessing. Caleb Hart was apparently in some kind of arrangement with the Mercer woman. People weren't sure what kind. The most charitable interpretation was that he felt sorry for her. The least charitable interpretations were various and ran the full spectrum of small-town imagination. Nobody asked Caleb directly. He was not the kind of man you asked directly about personal matters, not because he was frightening, but because he had a quietness about him that made such questions feel rude. Nobody asked Lydia either, but for different reasons. They simply didn't think to. She moved through Harlan Creek on her occasional trips to town like a woman who existed on a different frequency from the social rhythms of the place. She was not unfriendly. She was just elsewhere. The first time things got complicated was a Thursday in mid-October. Caleb arrived to find the door to the dugout open and Lydia crouched in front of it with a piece of timber in her hands, examining the door frame with an expression that meant something was wrong. "What happened?" he said, dismounting. "Hinge pulled out of the frame." She didn't look up. "The wood's rotted on the right side. It's been soft for a while." He looked at the frame. She was right. The wood near the top hinge had gone gray and soft, probably from moisture getting in around the sod roof. It wasn't catastrophic, but with winter coming on, it was the kind of thing that would get worse fast. "Do you have timber?" he asked. "Some. Not enough to replace the whole frame." "I have timber at the ranch." She stood up and looked at him. "I wasn't asking. I know you weren't." He tied his horse. "But I have it, and you need it, so either I can bring it next week, or you can freeze half to death this winter because the door doesn't seal. Either works for me." She stared at him. He kept his face neutral, which took some effort because there was something that might have been humor trying to work its way in at the edges. "That's a very pushy offer," she said. "I've been told I'm pushy when I think I'm right about something." "Who told you that?" "My second hired hand, Frank. He says it more colorfully, but that's the gist." She looked at the door frame again, looked back at him. "I'll pay for the timber." "You can pay me in bread," he said. A long pause. "That's not a fair trade." "We can argue about fair when your door doesn't fall off," he said, and went around to the side of the dugout to look at the roof and see what else might need attention before the season turned. Behind him, he heard her make a short, sharp sound that might, from someone else, have been the beginning of a laugh. He came back the following week with timber in the wagon bed and Frank Dugan riding alongside to help, because replacing a door frame was a two-person job, and Caleb wasn't foolish enough to suggest Lydia shouldn't be working on her own home. Frank was 23 and cheerful in the exhausting way of people who haven't yet had enough bad things happen to them to teach them the value of quiet. He kept trying to start conversations with Lydia while they worked, which she answered with one or two words before returning to whatever she was doing, which was everything. She was right there working alongside them, handing tools, holding timber in place, not standing back and waiting for the men to finish. At one point, Frank said, with the bright confidence of someone who had completely misread the situation, "You know, ma'am, a woman living alone out here, it must be real lonely." And Lydia, without looking up from the nail she was hammering, said, "Lonelier with the wrong company than with no company at all." And Frank shut up and looked at Caleb, and Caleb looked at the door frame and didn't say anything because there was nothing to add to that. When the frame was done and the door hung level and sealed properly, Lydia tested it twice, running her hand along the edges, checking the hinge movement. "Good," she said, not to either of them specifically, to the door. She went inside and came back with a loaf and handed it to Caleb. She had already cut it so that Frank could have a piece on the ride back, which neither of them had asked for, and which was, in a very small and practical way, the most generous thing Caleb had seen anyone do in a while. Frank ate his piece before they'd gotten 50 yards from the dugout. "She's something else," he said. "Yeah," said Caleb. "You like her." "I came to fix a door." "You brought timber from your own ranch to fix a stranger's door, and you're going to tell me you just like her bread." Caleb rode in silence for a moment. The sky had gone that dense gray of late afternoon, the clouds low and heavy with the first promise of cold. "Mind your own business, Frank?" Frank smiled and kept riding and had the good sense not to push it further. Bisam. The thing about Lydia was that she didn't make anything easy, and this wasn't a character flaw. It was, Caleb understood more each time he came, a feature of who she was that had been shaped by years of everything being hard. She trusted carefully. She accepted help the way you'd accept something potentially dangerous, with both hands, eyes open, ready. She had a story she told him in pieces over those Thursday visits, never all at once, as if she was testing whether he'd be there next time before she gave him more. Her mother had died when she was 15. Fever, fast, no warning. After that, it had just been Lydia and her father and her brother in that Ohio farmhouse. And she had become the person who managed things, who learned to cook and preserve and calculate what the household needed and by how much and in what order of priority. "My father used to say I was more practical than any man he'd ever met," she told Caleb once. He meant it as a compliment. Was it? At 15, it made me feel proud. She looked at the fire through the oven door. Later, I understood it also meant he'd stopped worrying about whether I needed things that weren't practical. She paused. He was a good man. He just ran out of room in his concern. Caleb thought about that for a long time after he left that evening. He thought about what it would be like to be 15 years old and to become, almost overnight, the person in a household that other people depended on. To have competence become your identity so completely that no one thought to ask if you were all right, because the evidence of your all rightness was everywhere, in the organized kitchen, in the managed budget, in the way things worked. He had done a version of that himself, after his own fashion. Not through loss, but through choice, or something that had felt like choice at the time. Build the ranch. Make it work. Show that you are the kind of person who can be counted on. Become the thing people could depend on. He was 31, and he lived alone in a house with 2 hired hands and a dog and account books that balanced exactly, and a life that, if you looked at it from the outside, was completely in order. He thought maybe Lydia understood that in a way most people didn't. The last Thursday of October, he arrived to find her sitting outside in the cold, her back against the dugout wall, knees pulled up, staring at nothing in particular. She had a smear of something dark across one cheek, soot, probably, and her hands were in her lap and she wasn't moving. He dismounted quietly. Chester, who had started coming along on the Thursday rides and who had decided that Lydia was acceptable after she'd fed him a piece of crust without being asked, went over and sat down next to her. She let her hand fall on the dog's head without looking at him. "Bad day?" Caleb said. "Oven cracked," she said. "On the back left side. I don't know yet if I can fix it or if I have to take down that section and rebuild." He sat down on the ground beside her, his back against the wall, which was cold through his jacket, but he wasn't going to make a thing of it. "How long to rebuild if you have to?" 3 days minimum, if the clay sets right. She was still staring ahead. "I have 4 loaves due to Webb by Friday." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet." "Tell him Saturday. He'll grumble. He's going to lose sales." "He's going to lose them by a day. He'll be all right." Caleb stretched his legs out. "The crack. Where exactly?" She described it. He listened without interrupting, which he'd learned was important with her. She worked things out by describing them, and if you jumped in with solutions before she'd finished, you'd interrupted the actual thinking. "The corner section might be salvageable," she said finally. "If I can patch from the inside with new clay and give it 4 days before I fire again. Can you do that before the temperature drops?" "If I start tomorrow." She looked at Chester, who was leaning against her leg with his eyes half closed. "I hate this," she said quietly. "When something I built breaks and I don't know right away if I can fix it." "That's not specific to ovens," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "No," she said. "It isn't." They sat against the cold wall in the gray afternoon while Chester dozed between them, and neither of them said anything else for a little while. And it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable, which was something neither of them particularly had words for yet. After a while, Lydia got up and said she was going to start assessing the crack before the light was completely gone, and Caleb got up and helped her, because that was what you did. The October wind came across the prairie in long, cold pulls that smelled of frost. Lydia crouched at the back of the oven with a candle, examining the crack with the focused, unsentimental attention she gave to every problem, seeing it clearly, without panic, working out what was true before deciding what to do. Caleb held the candle steady and didn't say anything and let her think. Outside, the light faded from the Nebraska sky in layers. Gold, then orange, then a purple-gray that turned everything soft and unclear. The crack, she decided after a long time, could be patched. She would start tomorrow. She would get the bread to Webb by Saturday. She would be all right. She was always all right. But tonight, for just a small piece of an hour, with the wind outside and the candle between them and Chester's warm weight somewhere near her feet, she let herself sit with the fact that it was a little less hard when someone else was there. Just that. Nothing more. Just the small, terrifying comfort of not being alone. The oven crack took 4 days to fix, not 3. Lydia had started on it the morning after Caleb left, in that cold gray hour before full light when the temperature sat just above freezing and her breath made small clouds in the air inside the dugout. She mixed the patching clay by feel more than measure. She'd learned that the consistency mattered more than the ratio, that good clay had a specific resistance in your palms, a weight that told you it would hold. She worked in silence except for the wind outside and the occasional sound of Chester, who had apparently decided to return on his own and was now scratching at the door until she let him in. "He does that," Caleb had said the previous evening when Chester had turned up at the dugout for the second time in as many weeks without being accompanied by his owner. "He picks people." "He picked me or he picked my bread," Lydia had said. "Probably both. He's practical." She had given the dog a piece of crust and tried not to feel warmed by the fact that a man's dog had independently decided she was worth visiting. Now she mixed clay in the cold dawn light with Chester breathing against her ankle, and she thought about cracks. How they started. Usually not from one dramatic event, usually from small repeated stresses, from the same point being hit the same way too many times until the structure gave. The oven had been taking the same heat cycle for 3 years. It was not a failure. It was just time telling the truth about what was wearing. She patched in 3 layers, the way she'd built the original, letting each layer cure before adding the next. She kept the fire low, barely above coals, to maintain the temperature of the clay without shocking it. She slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check, feeding the fire by feel in the dark. On the 4th morning, she ran a full heat cycle and watched the crack site for 3 hours without moving from her stool. It held. She delivered the bread to Webb on Saturday, 2 days late. He did grumble, exactly as Caleb had predicted. He stood behind his counter with the look of a man who had calculated what the delay had cost him and was deciding whether to say the number out loud. 2 days, he said. Oven needed repair. It won't happen again this season. It better not. I had 3 people asking Friday. He examined the loaves with a professional eye, turning one over in his thick hands. These look right. They are right. He set it down and looked at her. You tell me when you have a problem. I can't plan if I don't know. I'm telling you now. It's fixed. He made a sound that was neither agreement nor argument and began shelving the loaves, and Lydia took her payment and left. And that was the end of it, because neither of them were people who needed to make more of a thing than it was. She walked back to her wagon and stood there for a moment in the thin November sunlight, the coins in her coat pocket, and let herself feel, just briefly, privately, the satisfaction of having solved her own problem. The oven had cracked. She had fixed it. The bread was on the shelf. The arrangement continued. She was still here. She had not collapsed. These were the quiet victories of her life, and she had learned to take them seriously. What she had not learned, and was only now beginning to understand might require learning, was what to do when someone else started to notice them too. Caleb came the following Thursday with a small sack of dried apples from his root cellar, which he set on her table without announcement or explanation, the same way she'd set bread near him without asking. He looked at the oven immediately when he came in, running a quick eye across the back left corner the way a man checks a fence repair. Not dramatically, just making sure it held. It held, she said, before he could ask. I can see that. He settled into the chair she'd started leaving out. She hadn't made a formal decision about that. The chair had simply migrated from the wall to the center of the room over the past few weeks without her acknowledging it. You sleep? Some. Frank bet me you'd have it fixed in 3 days. 4. I won then. She glanced at him. You bet on my oven repair. I bet that you'd take exactly as long as it needed and not rush it. He picked up one of the dried apples from the sack and ate it. Frank thought you'd push it. I know better. She looked at him for a moment, this man sitting in her chair eating his own dried apples in her home, who had apparently been paying enough attention to have an opinion about how she approached problems. There was something unsettling about it that she couldn't quite resolve. Not bad unsettling, but the kind that meant a shift in the arrangement of things. You don't know me that well, she said. I know you pretty well, he said simply, without defensiveness. She turned back to the dough she was working. Don't get ahead of yourself, Hart. I'm not, he said. I'm exactly where I am. She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. The wind had come up outside, the kind of November wind that moved through the prairie grass in long, sustained pulls, and found every gap in the dugout's construction. She had stuffed the worst of them with cloth and clay through the autumn, but a few remained, and on windy days the candle flame bent toward them in a way that made her aware of exactly how thin the barrier between inside and outside really was. The north corner, Caleb said, looking at the ceiling where the sod met the timber. You've got a gap up there. I know. I need to get up and repack it before the snow. I can do it now if you have clay and a ladder. I don't have a ladder. I can stand on the chair. She turned around and looked at him, standing on her one good chair in her one-room home, and started calculating whether this was the kind of help she could accept or the kind that made things complicated. She was still running this calculation when he was already moving the chair to the corner. You're going to break it, she said. I'm not going to break it. He stepped up. Hand me something to pack with. She handed him a roll of clay she'd been keeping for repairs, and he worked on the corner gap with the focused, unsentimental efficiency he brought to everything physical. No commentary, no show of effort, just the task getting done. A small amount of dried dirt and old clay came down when he cleared the gap, landing on his shoulder and in his hair, and he brushed it off without stopping. When he was done, he stepped down and moved the chair back and looked at the corner. "Better," he said. "Thank you," she said. She was careful with those two words because she didn't use them loosely. He seemed to understand this because he just nodded and sat back down and picked up another dried apple, and neither of them made anything more of it. This was, she had come to understand, one of the things she valued most about his company. He didn't require transactions. He helped because something needed doing and he was there, and then it was done, and they moved on. He didn't catalog the help in a way that suggested she owed him something. Most people, most men especially, had a running ledger. You could feel it. Caleb didn't seem to have one, or if he did, he kept it somewhere she couldn't detect. She wasn't sure yet whether to trust that. She had trusted the wrong arithmetic before. Not romantically. She had not had occasion for that particular lesson, but she had trusted her father's ledger, the one that said she was capable and therefore fine, and discovered when he died that being capable and being fine were not the same category of thing at all. She had trusted the plan that said if you worked hard enough at something real, it would sustain you, and discovered that real didn't automatically mean enough. She was careful about trust, now the way you're careful on ice, not refusing to walk, but paying attention to every step. The Thursday visits continued through November. They had developed a shape without either of them designing one. He arrived in the mid-morning, when she was usually in the middle of a bake cycle, and she let him in and they talked while she worked, and he stayed 2 or 3 hours, sometimes helping with something physical, sometimes just present in the way that she had stopped trying to be annoyed by. He told her things about the ranch in pieces, the same way she told him things about herself, not in organized explanations, but in the natural fragments of conversation, one thing leading to another. He'd bought the operation 6 years ago from a man named Aldous Pratt, who'd decided he was too old for Nebraska winters and wanted to spend his remaining years somewhere with trees. The first year, Caleb had barely kept the herd alive through a brutal winter and had finished the season with fewer cattle than he'd started with, and a debt that made the account books hard to look at directly. "What did you do?" Lydia asked. "Kept going." "That's not a strategy." "It was the only one I had." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't have enough to quit with. Going back east would have meant admitting the whole thing was a mistake, and I wasn't willing to call it that yet." He paused. Sometimes stubbornness and faith are the same thing wearing different coats. She considered this. "And you turned it around, slowly. Made better decisions the second year. Hired Frank, who's annoying but competent. The herd came back." He shifted in the chair. "I'm not going to pretend it was more complicated than that. Work and time." "Most things are work and time," she said. "Most things," he agreed. She had a feeling he wasn't just talking about the cattle. The first real snow came the second week of November. Not a storm, just a steady, matter-of-fact snowfall that arrived overnight and covered the prairie in 8 inches of white by morning. Lydia woke to the particular quiet of snow, that specific absence of sound that told you the world had changed shape while you were sleeping. She dressed in the cold and went outside. The prairie under snow was a different country, flat and white and perfectly unmarked in every direction, the horizon line gone soft, where the sky and the ground blurred together. The cottonwoods along the creek were bare black lines against it. Her garden plot was a smooth white rectangle. The trail that led toward town was gone entirely, indistinguishable from the surrounding field. It was beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when they also meant more work. She got the fire going and started the oven and was in the middle of her first batch when she heard hoofbeats she recognized by now. Caleb's roan had a slightly heavier pace than most, a rhythm she'd learned without meaning to. She opened the door before he knocked. He was standing there with snow on his hat and his coat and a package under one arm, looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "It's not Thursday," she said. "I was checking the east fence line and I thought I'd see how you were through the snow." She looked past him at the pristine white prairie, where his tracks came from the south and slightly west, which was not the direction of the east fence line. She looked back at him. He had the grace to look mildly caught. "Come in," she said, and stood aside. He came in and set the package on the table. It was salt pork, wrapped in brown paper. "From the smokehouse," he said preemptively, before she could ask or object. "Frank cured more than we need this year, and it's taking up space." She looked at the package. Looked at him. You rode 40 minutes out of your way in first snow to bring me salt pork that was taking up space. The fence line brought me most of the way. The fence line that runs west. A pause. The fence connects, he said, eventually. The smallest beginning of a smile moved across her face before she controlled it. Sit down, she said, and turned back to the oven. They were quiet for a while, the fire doing its work, the snow muffling the world outside to a near silence. She checked the loaves and rotated them and checked the draft, and Caleb watched her work the way he always did. Not like someone watching a curiosity, but the way you watch something that interests you because of what it reveals about the person doing it. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask? When you decided to stay, after your father died, did you tell anyone? Did you have someone to talk to about it? She thought about it. The real answer, the honest one, surfaced quickly. No, there was no one to ask. My brother was already gone by then, practically. A few women from a church committee came out that first spring, brought food, asked if I needed help finding a situation somewhere. She paused. A situation. That's what they called it. They meant, don't you want to go somewhere and work for someone else in a house that already exists? What did you say? I thanked them for the food and said I had a situation already. She checked the draft on the oven. They didn't come back. Did you want them to? This was the kind of question that required honesty, and honesty required courage, and she had plenty of the second but had spent years being careful about the first. Sometimes, she said. Not often. Mostly I was too busy to notice. She looked at him. Why? He seemed to consider the question. Not the why of her decision, but why he'd asked. Because I did the same thing, he said. When the first winter nearly ruined everything, I didn't tell anyone how bad it was. I had an older rancher, Harv Sellers, lived north of here, who would have helped. He'd offered, and I didn't tell him. Why not? Because I thought asking meant I hadn't managed it right. She was quiet. I know that's not logical, he said. No, I understand it completely, she said. That's the problem. He looked at her. She was looking at the oven, but she was also, clearly, understanding something that landed between them without needing to be said explicitly. That they had both spent years treating their own difficulty as evidence of personal failure rather than just the honest weight of hard circumstances, and that this was something neither of them had told another person before. Outside, the snow kept falling in that soft, indifferent way of Nebraska winters that didn't care what you were doing inside. The town's opinion, which had been building quietly since October, began to come to a head in December. Lydia first understood this when Martha Gaines stopped her outside the Mercantile on a cold Wednesday and said, with the studied casualness of someone who has been rehearsing, You know people are talking, Lydia. People always talk, Lydia said. About you and Caleb Hart. She kept her face even. Mr. Hart buys my bread. He's a customer. Martha looked at her with the expression of a woman who knows more than she's being given credit for. He fixed your door. My husband saw the wagon with the timber. My door needed fixing. He had timber. Lydia shifted the basket to her other arm. That's a very ordinary series of events, Martha. For an ordinary friendship, Martha said, with the particular emphasis women used when they meant friendship to mean something else entirely. Lydia looked at her steadily. Was there something you needed from the store? Martha blinked. No, Then I'll let you get on. She walked past her into the Mercantile, set her basket on the counter, and did not let her face do anything until she was facing the shelves with her back to the room. She heard Marcus Webb behind her say, to the other customer who'd been present, Don't ask her about it. I've known that woman 2 years. You don't ask her about it. Smart man, Marcus. She picked out her flour and her salt and paid precisely and left. And on the drive back to the dugout, she made herself look at the thing directly, the way she looked at problems in the oven. Clearly, without flinching, people were talking about her and Caleb. This meant they had noticed something, which meant there was something to notice, which meant she needed to decide what she actually thought about that, what she actually thought was a problem, because what she thought was not simple. What she thought involved the way his voice sounded in the closed space of the dugout, lower and more careful than it was in town. What she thought involved the fact that she noticed every Thursday what time it was when she heard his horse, and what she did with the hour before he arrived. What she thought involved the chair. She had moved that chair, not consciously. And yet, she didn't do things unconsciously. She was a person who made deliberate decisions about everything from the moisture content of her clay to the ratio of rye in her bread. She did not accidentally rearrange her furniture. She gripped the reins of the gray mare and looked at the flat white road ahead and thought, "This is a problem because I am not a person things like this happen to." Men like Caleb Hart, established, respected, a man who owned 900 acres and whose opinion people sought at county meetings, did not come courting women who lived in holes in the ground. And if they did, it was not for reasons that ended well for the woman in the hole. She had built too much to lose any of it to wishful thinking. She had been practical her whole life. She would be practical about this too. She decided to be cooler, not cold. She wasn't going to be cruel about it, but cooler, more professional. She would dial back whatever had been warming between them, quietly and without drama, and things would return to a clear, sensible arrangement where she sold bread and he bought it and they had perfectly fine conversations about practical matters. She had this plan fully formed by the time she reached the dugout. Caleb arrived on Thursday looking like a man who'd had a rough week. There was a set to his jaw she recognized by now as tiredness hiding behind composure, and he came in and sat down in the chair with the heaviness of someone whose body had been doing too much. She brought him a piece of bread without asking, the way she'd stopped asking a month ago, and set it near him. He ate it, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased visibly, and she stood at the oven with her back to him and reminded herself about the plan. "You all right?" she said, because that was just a normal question. It didn't count. "Lost a calf this morning, first one this season." He turned the bread over in his hands. "It's not uncommon, still feels bad." "How old?" 2 weeks. Came through the birth fine, just didn't..." He stopped. "Just didn't make it." He looked at the fire through the oven door. "Frank thinks I get too attached to the animals." "Do you?" "I think Frank doesn't get attached enough." A pause. "But, yeah, probably." She thought about a man who could run a 900-acre cattle operation with the discipline and competence that everyone in the county observed, and who also felt bad about a 2-week-old calf, and she thought about how those two things existed in the same person without contradiction, and the plan she had made on the drive home on Wednesday shifted slightly, like ice settling. "That's not a flaw," she said. "No? Caring about what you're responsible for isn't a flaw. It's the whole point of being responsible for something." He looked at her. The fire crackled. Chester, who had arrived before Caleb again and was now fully domesticated to the point of having a spot on the floor he considered his own, lifted his head briefly and then put it back down. "You're easier to talk to than most people," Caleb said. "Most people talk too much when what you need is someone to listen." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn that?" She thought about it. "From being talked at by people who weren't actually listening," she said. "I figured out fast that I didn't want to do that to someone else." He ate the last of the bread. He looked at the wall for a moment, then back at her, and she recognized the expression. He was deciding whether to say something. "Lydia," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. She turned back to the oven. Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. "Whatever you're about to say." "Don't say it yet." "Why?" "Because I'm still figuring something out." She checked the draft, adjusted it. "And I don't want you to say something before I finished figuring it out, because then I'll have to respond to what you said instead of to what I actually think." A long silence. "All right," he said. "Just that. No pressure, no wounded pride." She let out a breath she hadn't been aware she was holding. They talked about other things. The snow, the fence, the price of winter feed, the question of whether the road to town would be passable by wagon through December, or whether she'd need to go on horseback for the worst of it. Practical, sensible things. The kind of conversation she'd told herself she wanted them to have. But when he stood to leave and she walked him to the door he had fixed, the frame he had brought timber for, he paused on the threshold and looked at her with the straightforward, unguarded way he had, that she had still not learned to be comfortable with. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She stood in the doorway and watched him ride south until he was a small, dark shape against the white prairie, and then a nothing. Chester sat beside her, and they both looked at the empty landscape for a moment. "Don't look at me," she told the dog. Chester leaned against her leg. The wind came off the plains, cold and clean and indifferent as ever. Inside the dugout, the oven held its heat quietly, The clay packed solid in the repaired corner, everything she had built still standing. She was still here. She had not collapsed. But for the first time in 3 years, she was not entirely sure that standing alone was the same as standing strong. December came in hard and without apology. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 days and stayed there, the kind of cold that settled into the ground and the walls and the bones of things, and made you understand that the prairie in winter was not a place that tolerated mistakes. Lydia had prepared for it. She'd spent October and November doing exactly that, sealing gaps and stacking wood and putting up the last of the root vegetables in the cold corner of the dugout that stayed just above freezing. She had a system for winters. She had survived 2 of them already, but this one felt different, and she wasn't sure if that was the weather or something else entirely. She spent the first week of December baking and thinking, which were for her almost the same activity. The thinking she was doing was the kind you couldn't avoid. It had the quality of a slow leak, working its way in through every quiet moment, every hour she spent alone in the dugout, with only the sound of the wind and the oven and Chester's breathing for company. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. She had turned those words over so many times they'd become smooth, like river stones. She examined them for the thing she was afraid was underneath them. Some version of patience that was really just strategy, kindness that was really just maneuvering. She had seen that before in other men, not directed at her, but at women she'd known. The careful campaign of consideration that was always, eventually, about something the man wanted. She could not find that in Caleb, which was either because it wasn't there or because she was not looking clearly. She wasn't sure which possibility frightened her more. On the second Thursday of December, he arrived with snow still melting in his hair and a look on his face that said the ride had been difficult. The road from the south was drifted in 3 places, and he'd had to take the horse through the field beside it, which was slower and harder going. She knew this because she'd ridden the same route 2 days earlier and had noted the drifts with the calculating eye of someone who needed to know exactly how bad a road had to get before it became impassable. She had also noted, without meaning to, that she had wondered whether he'd come despite the drifts. He had. He came in, and she handed him coffee. She'd started making it on Thursday mornings, just enough for 2 cups, which was another thing she hadn't made a formal decision about. And he wrapped both hands around the cup and sat down and said, "You should come to town more." She raised an eyebrow. "Not because of anything other than the roads," he said. "When it gets worse, you're going to be cut off out here." "I know how to manage a bad winter, Caleb." "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." "Say it once, then." He gave her the look he used when she'd said something that had closed a door he'd been trying to open carefully. "Once," he agreed. She sat across from him, which she'd also stopped thinking about. The sitting across, the coffee, the fact that the space had reorganized itself around 2 people without asking her permission. "How's the herd?" "Down another calf. Different problem. Cold got to it before we found it in the north pasture." He drank the coffee. "Frank feels worse about it than I do this time, which is progress for Frank." Or regression. A short laugh, genuine and a little surprised. She liked that about his laugh. It was never performed. It came when something actually struck him as funny, and not before. "Could be," he said. They talked for a while about the practical mathematics of winter, her wood supply, his feed situation, the state of the road that connected both their properties to Harlan Creek. Caleb mentioned that Gunnar Lindqvist had apparently decided to winter with his daughter's family in Omaha this year, which left the north stretch without anyone checking it. "He didn't tell me," Lydia said. "He didn't tell anyone, just closed up and left. His daughter wrote to the post office about it." She thought about Gunnar, his sharp blue eyes, and his economy of words, the way he had shown up those 11 days 3 years ago and helped her build the dugout without making it mean anything complicated. She hoped he was warm in Omaha. She hoped his daughter had a good house. "I should check his place," she said. "I already did. Everything's shut proper." Caleb set down the cup. "He left the woodpile covered. He'll be all right." She looked at him. It was a small thing, checking on an old man's empty property. But it was the kind of small thing that said a great deal about the shape of a person's attention. He had thought to do it, had simply done it, without making it a story. She went back to the bread. The loaves she was proofing had another hour. She shaped 2 small rolls from the remaining dough. Test pieces for a new technique she was trying, folding the dough differently to see how it affected the crumb structure, and set them near the oven to rise. What are those? He asked. Experiment. What are you trying to figure out? She explained the fold technique, the way it trapped air differently, the crumb structure she was aiming for, denser than a regular roll but with more internal layers, something that would hold up better to being carried in a coat pocket through cold weather without going to mush. She was thinking about the ranch hands, about Frank specifically, who she'd noticed ate standing up half the time and needed food that was portable. She realized partway through explaining this that she had been thinking about Frank's eating habits, which meant she had been thinking about the ranch, which meant she had been thinking about things that were not strictly her own concern. Caleb was watching her with that still, focused attention she still hadn't entirely gotten used to. "What?" she said. Nothing, but the corner of his mouth had moved. "Say it." "You're thinking about people," he said, "not just logistics." She turned back to the dough. "I'm thinking about bread." "You're thinking about who's going to eat it." She didn't answer because he was right, and she didn't have a response that wasn't an admission of something she wasn't ready to admit. The rolls came out well. She put one near him on the table, the way she always did, without making it into anything. He picked it up and bit into it and chewed slowly, the way he did when he was actually evaluating something rather than just eating. "It's good," he said. "The bottom layer is still too tight. I need to adjust the fold tension." She pulled it apart and looked at the cross-section critically. "But the top 3 layers are right. If you brought these to Webb, he'd sell out in a day." "I know, that's not the point yet. The point is getting it right." He looked at her for a moment. "You never do anything halfway, do you?" "What would be the purpose of that?" He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in something that looked more like wonder, which she found harder to look at directly than almost any other expression he had. She had spent 3 years building a life that worked on the principle of exact sufficiency. Enough wood, enough flour, enough money, enough competence. She had calibrated herself down to the minimum necessary to survive and had stopped thinking about what was beyond that threshold, because thinking about it was expensive and she had nothing to spend. Caleb kept looking at her like the threshold didn't exist, like he was looking at the whole field, not just the fence line. It was terrifying in a way she had no existing framework for. The thing that broke the careful equilibrium she'd been maintaining wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight or a declaration or a crisis. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of December when she was in town and ran into Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn Marsh was the wife of Thomas Marsh, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county after Caleb, and she was the kind of woman who had learned early that social position was a resource you managed like any other, carefully, strategically, without waste. She was not cruel, exactly. She was precise. And she was standing outside the dry goods store when Lydia came around the corner, and the look on her face when she saw Lydia had something in it that made Lydia's spine go flat. "Miss Mercer," Evelyn said, with the particular warmth of someone who has decided to be gracious about something they find distasteful. "Mrs. Marsh, I've been meaning to speak with you." She glanced around the street, a practice check for audience. "About Caleb Hart." Lydia waited. "He's a good man," Evelyn said. "A very good man. Everyone in the county thinks highly of him." A pause. "Which is why I think it's worth being honest with you, woman to woman, that what looks like interest from a man of his position isn't always what it appears. Sometimes a man is just lonely, and loneliness can make him behave in ways that give a woman the wrong impression." The words were arranged carefully. They had clearly been thought about. The intent was to be kind, or to present as kind, while delivering the message that Lydia was being naive, and that whatever she imagined was happening with Caleb Hart was a misunderstanding of how the world worked. Lydia looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I appreciate your concern," she said then, evenly. "Was there something you needed from the store?" Evelyn blinked, her expression adjusted. "I'm trying to help you." "I understand that's how you're framing it." A beat of silence. Something in Evelyn's face shifted. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. "You're a very direct person, Miss Mercer. I find it saves time." Lydia shifted her basket. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Marsh." She went into the store and bought what she needed and did not let her hand shake until she was back in the wagon and 3 minutes down the road where no one could see her. Then she let them shake for exactly 1 minute, which was her policy on that sort of thing. She wasn't shaking because Evelyn Marsh had frightened her. She was shaking because Evelyn Marsh had said out loud the specific thing Lydia had been telling herself quietly for weeks. A man like that doesn't mean what you think he means. She had been living with that thought like a splinter, and having someone else say it out loud had made it larger and harder to ignore. She drove home through the cold white afternoon and did not hum and did not think about bread ratios, and went inside and stood in the middle of her dugout and looked at the chair in the center of the room. Then she pulled it back to the wall where it had originally lived. She stood back and looked at the room. It felt wrong. The proportions were off. The room looked like a room again instead of a space where two people could be present at the same time. She left the chair against the wall and went to tend the oven and refused to think about it further. Caleb noticed on Thursday. He came in and there was a half-second pause before he sat down, just enough that she knew he'd registered it. He didn't say anything. He sat in the chair against the wall without comment, which left him farther from the table and slightly awkward, and still said nothing about it. They talked about other things. The weather, the herd. Whether the creek had frozen solid yet or just along the edges. About 40 minutes in, Caleb put his hands on his knees and looked at her directly. "Something's changed," he said. "Nothing's changed." The chair moved. "Furniture doesn't have a permanent position." "Lydia, I'm not going to pretend I don't notice things," he said, quietly, but with the kind of steadiness that didn't leave room for deflection. "You moved the chair back. You've been different since I came in. Something happened between Thursday and now." She stood at the oven with her back to him and looked at the fire through the iron door and thought about what she had built here, and what it had cost her, and what it would cost to lose it. "Evelyn Marsh spoke to me in town," she said. A silence. "What did she say?" Lydia turned around. She had decided in the moment that the words came out of her mouth that she was going to say the real version of this. Not a softened version, not a version designed to protect anyone's feelings. The real one. She said that men of your position sometimes behave in ways that give women in my position the wrong impression. That loneliness makes men appear to be interested when they're not. Caleb's face went through several things quickly. She watched him land on stillness. "She's wrong," he said. "Maybe she is. But the thing is—" Lydia stopped. Started again. "The thing is, I have been telling myself a version of the same thing, not as neatly, but the same thing." She kept her voice level. It took effort. "I have been trying to be practical about this, about you. And practical to me means not building on something that isn't there." "It's there," he said. He hadn't moved. "Lydia, I've ridden out here through 2 snowdrifts every Thursday for 2 months. I brought timber for your door. I brought salt pork for my smokehouse. I check your oven before I check anything else when I come in." He paused. "I don't do those things because I feel sorry for you. I do them because I can't think of a reason not to be here." She looked at him. The firelight from the oven moved across the room and made everything warm and unsteady. "That's not a declaration," she said. "No," he said. "I know you asked me not to make one yet, so that's not one." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "But I need you to know that whatever Evelyn Marsh thinks she understands about my intentions, she's wrong. And whatever part of you is using her words to talk yourself out of this—" He stopped. "I'm asking you not to do that." She was quiet for a long time. The oven ticked and popped. Chester, who had been asleep in his spot, shifted and sighed. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. The words came out smaller than she'd intended. "I know how to survive. I know how to build things and fix things and calculate what I need to get through a season. I don't know how to—" She stopped again, because the sentence ended in territory she had no map for. "I don't either," Caleb said. "I've spent 6 years building a ranch and I'm very good at that, and I'm not entirely sure I know how to do much else." He said it simply, without self-pity. "So we're both going to be bad at it. That seems fair." Something in her chest did something she couldn't categorize. Not quite relief. Something more complicated than that. "I moved the chair because I got frightened," she said. She hadn't planned to say that, but it was true, and she was tired of carrying it around by herself. "I know," he said. "Don't tell me that was obvious." It was a little obvious. "Caleb?" The chair was a good 6 inches further from the table than it needed to be. That's not rearranging. That's retreating. He said it gently, without edge. "You can retreat if you need to. I told you I'm not going anywhere," she said. "Yes, I know." She crossed the room and moved the chair back to the center, which was an action so small and so enormous at the same time that she kept her eyes on the floor until it was done. When she looked up, Caleb was watching her with the expression she had the most trouble with. Not warm, exactly, because warm was too soft a word for it. It was the expression of someone who saw you specifically and was not confused or frightened by what they saw. "I'm still figuring it out," she said. "What I think, what I want. I know. I need you to not push. I won't. And I need you to keep coming on Thursdays." "I'll be here," he said. "Every Thursday." She nodded. Then she went back to the bread because that was what she did. And the bread was real, and the oven was real, and those were things she understood completely. But the chair stayed in the center of the room. The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were honest, which was better. She had stopped trying to cool things deliberately and started trying to just see them clearly, which was harder but produced less of the particular exhaustion that came from managing your own feelings like a budget. Caleb came on Thursdays and occasionally on other days when the route brought him near, and she stopped marking those occasions as violations of a rule and started taking them as what they were: a man who wanted to be in her company finding reasonable excuses to be in her company. She understood this because she occasionally checked the drift conditions on the South Road, which was not something she needed to do because she was not traveling south. Christmas came and went quietly. She had never made much of it. It was a day like others, slightly colder, with a particular sky, and this year she spent it baking and reading an old novel she'd read twice before and thinking about the year that had just passed. She had started it alone, and she was ending it in a different kind of alone, one that had a shape to it now, a specific absence on the days when no horse came from the south and no knock landed on her door. She hadn't had that before. Before, alone had been the whole condition. Now it was a state with edges, defined by the contrast to something else. She wasn't sure if that was better or worse, and suspected it was both. In the second week of January, Caleb arrived on a Thursday with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not troubled exactly, but carrying something. He came in and sat down and accepted his coffee and was quiet for longer than usual. She let him be quiet, because she had learned that with him, as with bread, you didn't rush things before they were ready. After a while he said, "I need to tell you something." "All right. There's a woman, was a woman, in Salina. Her name is Clara Hodge. Her father and my father knew each other, back east. After I got the ranch running, there was some correspondence between families. An understanding, I think, is the word they used." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Nothing formal, nothing agreed, but a direction. Lydia held very still. "I wrote to her in November," he said, "to tell her there wasn't going to be a direction anymore." She processed this. Several things at once. The understanding that there had been someone. The understanding that he had ended it. The understanding that he was telling her about it now, in January, which meant he had taken time between the ending and the telling. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you told me you don't want things that aren't clear. And this was something that needed to be clear." He looked at her directly. "There's no one else. There's not going to be someone else. I need you to know that." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the oven was steady and low, the kind it settled to after the morning's high heat, the kind that held warmth without burning. "The woman in Salina," she said carefully. "Did you care about her? I met her twice. She seemed like a good person." He paused. "I didn't think about her the way I think about you. I want to be honest about that." "How do you think about me?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. She had learned to tell the difference. "Like you're something I found that I didn't know I was looking for," he said, "and I don't want to stop looking at it." She looked down at her hands, which were resting on the table, flowers still faint in the creases of her knuckles. These hands that had built an oven and fixed it when it broke and kneaded several thousand loaves of bread and repaired her own door and planted and harvested and carried her through 3 years of a life that had asked everything of her. She thought about what it meant to let someone see those hands, and not as evidence of hardship, but as evidence of something worth seeing. "I'm going to need more time," she said. "I know. I'm serious, Caleb. I don't move fast on things I can't afford to get wrong." "I know that too." He set down the cup. "I'm not asking you to move fast. I'm asking you to keep the door open." A pause. "The one I fixed." She looked up. He was watching her with the smallest suggestion of something at the corner of his mouth. Despite herself, and despite everything she'd been carefully managing, She felt something give way very slightly in her chest. Not dramatically, not a collapse, more like the sound a house makes when it settles. A small shift downward toward the ground. "Don't make jokes about the door," she said, but her voice had changed, and they both knew it. "I'll stop making jokes about the door," he said, not stopping at all. She shook her head and went back to her bread and said nothing else. And the afternoon light moved across the dugout floor the way winter light did, thin and white, and somehow more honest than the light of other seasons, as if the cold had stripped everything down to what was actually there. She was still frightened. That hadn't changed. But she had decided sometime in the last hour, without making a formal announcement of it to herself or anyone else, that she was done moving the chair. Whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, she was going to let it be what it was. That was as far as she could go today. For now, it was enough. February in Nebraska was the month that broke people. Not dramatically, not with a single storm or a single catastrophe. February broke you slowly through repetition. The same cold every morning, the same gray sky, the same wind finding the same gaps in the same walls. By February, people who had arrived in the territory full of conviction were quietly reconsidering their life choices, and people who had been there long enough to know better were simply enduring, head down, counting toward March with the grim patience of someone serving a sentence. Lydia had made a kind of peace with February. She treated it the way she treated other problems. She broke it into units. Not the whole month, just the day. Just the morning. Just the hour. Get through this hour and the next one will be its own thing. What she had not made peace with was the specific shape of this particular February, which was different from the previous two because she was no longer entirely alone in it. Not that Caleb was there constantly. He wasn't. He had a ranch to run, a herd to keep alive through the worst weeks of winter, and the road between their properties was sometimes impassable for days at a time. There were whole stretches, 4 days, 5 days, when she saw no one and heard nothing but wind and the occasional distant sound of a crow. But the Thursdays came. Even through February, even through the drifts and the gray and the cold that made the horse's breath come in great white clouds, he came. Sometimes he didn't stay long because the light was short and the ride back was hard in the dark and cold. But he came. And that was different from the February before it in a way that she had stopped trying to minimize. What she had also stopped trying to minimize, or at least had gotten worse at minimizing, was the fact that she had started looking forward to Thursday the way you looked forward to things that mattered. Not with excitement exactly. Excitement had always felt like a dangerous emotion to her, the kind that cost you something when it didn't pay out. More like a quiet orientation. The week had a direction now. Thursday was north. She didn't tell him that. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Chester knew. The dog arrived on Thursday mornings now with the reliability of a calendar, scratching at her door 2 hours before Caleb did, and she had stopped pretending this wasn't what it was and just fed him and let him take his spot on the floor and got on with baking. It was the last Thursday of February when things shifted again, though Lydia didn't recognize it as a shift while it was happening. These things rarely announced themselves. Caleb arrived with the particular look of a man who had been thinking about something for a while and had decided to stop thinking and start saying. She recognized it by now. There was a quality of resolution in how he sat down, a stillness that was different from his usual stillness. She put coffee near him and waited. "I want to build you a kitchen," he said. She looked at him. "Not instead of the dugout," he said quickly, because he had apparently anticipated her first objection. "Beside it. A proper structure with a wood floor and better ventilation and room to work. Somewhere, your oven isn't also your bedroom." She set down the cloth she'd been holding. "That's—" She stopped. Started again. "That's a significant thing to propose. I have the lumber. I've had it sitting at the ranch since fall because I've been trying to think of the right way to say this without you taking it wrong." "How would I take it wrong?" "Like I was telling you that what you've built here isn't good enough." She was quiet for a moment. That had in fact been her immediate instinct. A flicker of something defensive, the old reflex that translated help as inadequacy. She had felt it and was now sitting with the fact that he had anticipated it, which meant he had been thinking about her specific reactions with enough care to map them in advance. "It is good enough," she said. "It's worked for 3 years. I know it has." He turned the cup in his hands. But good enough for survival and good enough for what you're actually capable of are different things, and you know that better than anyone. You've been adjusting your technique around the limitations of this space since you got here. He paused. I watched you do it with the rye loaf. You were solving for the oven's problems, not yours. She opened her mouth and closed it again. He was right. She had been doing exactly that, calibrating her work to the constraints of a space that had never been designed for what she was using it for. The ceiling too low for proper airflow, the floor that absorbed moisture in thaw season, the single small window that made it nearly impossible to see the true color of a crust until she brought it outside. She had stopped noticing those constraints because she had been too busy working around them. Where would you build it? She said, which was not agreement, but was also not the flat refusal she might have produced 2 months ago. He had clearly thought about this. He described the positioning, attached to the east side of the dugout so she could move between the two spaces without going outside, larger footprint for a proper work surface and storage, the oven rebuilt inside it with better dimensions she could specify herself. She listened with the part of her mind that processed structures and logistics, and that part of her mind was saying yes before the rest of her had decided. You'd be doing a great deal of work on property that isn't yours, she said. I know. That's a strange investment. He looked at her steadily. Is it? The word investment sat in the air between them and clarified, in the silence after it, what they were actually talking about, which was not timber and floor joists. She looked at the table. Caleb, you don't have to answer that right now. I'm not ready to... I know. I'm not asking you to be. He picked up the coffee. I'm asking about the kitchen. That's the only question on the table today. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something almost frustrating about how patient he was, not passive, not withholding, just genuinely, steadily patient in a way that removed the pressure she'd spent her life using as a reason to keep people at a careful distance. You couldn't push against someone who wasn't pushing. Let me see the lumber first, she said. He nodded, once. That was all. He didn't push his advantage, didn't expand the yes into something larger than she'd offered, just took what she'd given and left room for the rest. This was, she thought, either the most trustworthy thing about him or the most dangerous. She still hadn't entirely decided which. Construction began in the first week of March, when the ground thawed enough to work. Caleb brought Frank and another hired hand named Dill, a taciturn man in his 40s who spoke perhaps 30 words a day, but who could read a structure problem as fast as anyone Lydia had ever seen. The three of them arrived on a Monday with a wagon loaded with lumber that Caleb had clearly been selecting and preparing over the winter. The boards were straight and dry and cut to lengths that suggested he'd been planning the dimensions for some time. Lydia worked alongside them from the first day. She had specific ideas about the oven placement and the work surface height and the direction of the ventilation, and she communicated these without apology and without asking whether they minded her input. Dill listened to her, asked 2 precise questions, and then built exactly what she described. Frank tried twice to offer an alternative suggestion and was overruled twice, graciously but firmly, and after that he stopped offering alternatives and just worked. It took 9 days. The new kitchen was not beautiful. The boards didn't match perfectly, and there was a gap near the north window that let in a finger of cold air, and the floor had a slight lean to the east that you could feel but not quite see. Lydia noted every imperfection and liked the structure more for them, because a perfect thing would have felt like it belonged to someone else. The oven she built herself. Over 3 days after the structure was complete, with Caleb doing nothing but handing her things when she asked, and staying out of her way when she didn't. She built it larger than the original, a full 18 inches deeper, which changed the heat distribution in ways she'd been calculating for months. And when she fired it for the first time and the warmth came off it in an even, steady wave that filled the room without the hot spots and dead zones she'd spent 3 years working around, she stood with both hands flat on the work surface and felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. Well, Caleb said from the doorway. It's right, she said. He nodded. He looked at the oven with the expression of someone who had helped make something happen and was satisfied by that, and didn't need it to be about him. Thank you, she said. It came out more directly than she'd planned. No qualifications, no careful surrounding of it with practical language. He looked at her. You did most of it. You brought the lumber and 3 men in 9 days. And you told them exactly what to do with all of it. He came inside and looked at the oven properly, running his eye along the lines of it. This is yours, Lydia. I just moved some materials around. She looked at him for a moment. She had known this was coming, not this specific moment, but something like it. A point where the weight of everything he'd done and everything she felt about it and everything she kept carefully not saying would reach a place where the careful not saying became its own kind of lie. She was tired of the careful not saying. Caleb, she said. He turned. I'm not good at this, she said. I want you to know that going in. I don't have. She stopped and made herself start again, more precisely. I've been alone for a long time. I've built everything I have by myself, and I know how to do that. What I don't know how to do is let someone be part of it without feeling like I'm giving pieces of it away. He was listening, completely. Not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually listening. The kitchen, she said. The chair. The coffee on Thursday mornings. She looked at the work surface, the new wide planks of it. I keep waiting for there to be a cost I haven't seen yet. There might be, he said quietly. I can't promise you there won't be. I can't promise anything won't go wrong, because things go wrong. He came a step closer, not crowding her, just less far away. What I can tell you is that the only thing I'm trying to do is be here. That's it. No ledger. She looked at him. The new kitchen smelled of fresh wood and clay and the first smoke of a new oven, a smell that had no previous associations, no old memories attached to it. A new smell for a new thing. I believe you, she said. She said it like a decision, because it was one, not a feeling, a choice. She had looked at the evidence, and she had run the numbers the way she ran everything, and the numbers said, this man has given you no reason to doubt him and every reason to trust him, and you have been waiting for the trick, and the trick has not come. And at some point you have to decide whether you are going to keep waiting or whether you are going to choose. She chose. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly, more like relief. The particular relief of someone who has been holding a careful stillness for a long time and is finally able to put it down. Okay, he said, just that. Okay, she said back. And that was it. No speeches, no declarations that landed like theater. Just two people in a new kitchen that smelled of wood and smoke, standing close enough that the space between them had changed its character. The town found out, as the town always found out, through the accumulation of observations. Martha Gaines's husband saw Caleb's wagon outside the Mercer property 4 days in a row in March and mentioned it at the feed store. The feed store passed it to the barber shop. The barber shop dispersed it in 6 directions simultaneously, and by the second week of March, the general population of Harlan Creek had assembled a picture from its usual combination of partial fact and full imagination. The picture was not entirely wrong. A man like Caleb Hart did not spend 9 days building a kitchen on a woman's property for purely commercial reasons. Even Harlan Creek could do that math. The commentary split, as it always did, along the lines of who liked the idea of things changing and who didn't. Evelyn Marsh was overheard telling someone at the post office that she couldn't imagine what Caleb was thinking, that the woman was respectable enough, but simply not. And here she paused in the particular way of people who want to say appropriate without saying appropriate, not what anyone would have expected for a man in his position. Doris Halverson at the post office had apparently disagreed with enough heat that Evelyn left earlier than she'd planned. Marcus Webb said nothing to anyone, but he quietly increased his standing order to 6 loaves per week without being asked, which was his version of a vote of confidence. Frank Dugan told anyone who'd listen that Caleb had been gone on the Mercer woman since October, and that it was about time everybody noticed and let it be a normal thing instead of making it complicated. Pete Garfield at the feed store said he thought it was a pity arrangement and he felt sorry for the girl. And 2 people told him directly that he was wrong, and Pete spent the rest of the week slightly bewildered because he had expected agreement. Old Gunnar Lindqvist, back from Omaha in late March, heard the whole thing from Doris Halverson in about 6 minutes and said, "Good," and walked home. And that was his entire contribution to the community discussion. Lydia heard pieces of all this through the selective reporting of Marcus Webb, who told her things when he thought she needed to know them, and withheld things when he thought knowing would just make her tired. She appreciated this more than she'd told him. "People are going to talk," she said, on a Wednesday in late March, setting her loaves on his counter. "They're going to do whatever they're going to do, Marcus said, examining the loaves. You going to let it bother you? She thought about it seriously, because she took his questions seriously, even when they were rhetorical. I think I'm going to let it be their problem, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That's new, he said. Yes, she said. It is. She took her payment and walked out into the March street, which smelled of mud and cold water, and faintly of the first suggestion that the ground was thinking about thaw. The sky was still winter gray, but with a different quality to it. The flatness of deep winter had started to give way to something with more movement, more depth. She drove back to the property in the thin afternoon light and went first to the new kitchen and built the fire in the new oven and stood while it climbed to temperature and thought about the year she'd had and the person she'd been at the start of it and the person she was now. Not different. That wasn't quite the right word. The core of her. The part that fixed things and calculated precisely and moved the chair back to the wall when she got frightened and moved it forward again when she decided to stop running from things. That part was the same. It had always been the same. What was different was the context around it. She had a kitchen now, larger than anything she'd imagined building on this land. She had a man who came on Thursdays and occasionally on other days when the route brought him near, and who had said, I'm not going anywhere, and had spent 6 months proving it one small consistent action at a time. She had Chester, who was currently already inside and lying near the new oven with his eyes closed, having apparently decided the new space met his standards. She put her hands on the work surface and felt the warmth starting to come off the clay dome into the room. In 3 years, she had built a life out of minimum necessary pieces, and she had been proud of that, and it had been right for what that time required. But minimums were constraints, not goals. She understood that now in a way she hadn't before, not because someone had told her, but because she had stood in a new kitchen that smelled of fresh wood and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the space around her was the right size for what she actually was. The oven reached temperature. She began the first real bake in the new space, working the dough with both hands, and the warmth built in the room around her and outside the window, the March sky did whatever it was going to do. She was still here. She had not collapsed. And for the first time since she'd come to this piece of Nebraska ground, still here felt like a beginning rather than just a result. Spring came to Nebraska the way it always did. Not gently, not as a reward for surviving winter, but as an argument. Cold one day, warm the next, the ground thawing and refreezing in cycles that made the road to town a different problem every morning. The cottonwoods along the creek put out their first pale green, then a late frost came and knocked most of it back. And they started over without complaint, because that was what cottonwoods did. Lydia watched all of this from the new kitchen window. A real window, glass, the first glass window she'd had on this property, and thought that there was something almost instructive about the way spring worked out here. It didn't ask permission. It didn't arrive when you were ready. It just kept coming back after every setback until eventually the warmth accumulated enough to hold. She had been thinking about accumulation a lot lately. The Thursday visits had changed in quality without changing in form. Caleb still came on Thursdays and occasionally on other days, still sat in the chair that now lived permanently in the center of the kitchen, still drank his coffee and talked about the ranch and listened to her talk about the bread with the same focused attention he'd always given it. The shape of the thing was the same, but inside the shape, something had settled. The way a new structure settles in its first season, the timber finding its true position, the small adjustments making themselves without drama. They were easier with each other. That was the simplest way to put it. The careful navigation of the earlier months, her retreating, him patient, both of them circling the actual thing without quite landing on it, had given way to something more direct, not effortless. She was still herself, still someone who moved carefully around anything that felt like exposure. But the effort was different now. It was the effort of honesty rather than the effort of concealment. An honest effort, she had found, was less exhausting by a significant margin. In April, Caleb asked if she wanted to see the ranch. They had talked about it in pieces. She knew the layout from his descriptions, could picture the north pasture and the bunkhouse and the kitchen arrangement he'd described as inadequate. But she had never been there. It had remained for the whole of their acquaintance, his place and her place, distinct territories with a long road between them. Why now? She asked. Because I want you to see it, he said. And because I'm tired of describing things you should just be able to look at. She thought about it for exactly one day and then said yes, because she had stopped using extended deliberation as a way to protect herself from things she actually wanted. He came on a Saturday morning, not a Thursday, a Saturday, which felt significant in a way she didn't examine too carefully, and they rode south together on horseback because the wagon road was still soft in places from the thaw. Chester ran alongside for the first mile before apparently deciding this was too much work and turning back. The ranch was larger than she'd pictured. Not the acreage, she'd known the acreage, but the sense of the place. The way the buildings sat in relation to each other and to the land, the particular character of a property that had been worked hard for 6 years by someone who actually cared about it. The fences were straight and maintained. The barn doors hung level. The equipment she could see was in use, not rusting in a field. These things mattered to her in the way that the specific gravity of clay mattered. They were information about how a person operated when no one was watching. Frank was fixing a harness near the barn when they rode in and gave them both a look of unconcealed satisfaction that Caleb appeared to be ignoring through sheer willpower. "Miss Mercer," Frank said. "Frank," she said. "Nice of you to finally come out. Boss has been wanting to show you the place since about October." "Frank," Caleb said, with a specific quality of patience that suggested this was a familiar dynamic. "I'm just saying." "Don't." Frank grinned and went back to the harness, entirely undeterred, and Lydia made a mental note that Frank was going to be someone she liked despite herself. Caleb showed her the property without narrating it too much, which she appreciated. He let her look, answered questions when she asked them, didn't fill the silence with promotional commentary about his own work. She saw the herd in the south pasture, smaller than she'd imagined from the numbers he'd mentioned, which meant the winter had been harder on them than he'd let on. She saw the root cellar and the smokehouse and the barn and the arrangement of the bunkhouse where Frank and Dill slept. Then he showed her the kitchen. It was, as he had described, inadequate. The space was serviceable but poorly laid out. The oven position wrong relative to the ventilation, the work surface too low, the storage haphazard. It was a kitchen designed by someone who thought of cooking as a function rather than a practice. She stood in the middle of it and turned in a slow circle. "I know," he said from the doorway. "The oven's in the wrong place." "I know. Everything's too low. Who set the surface height?" "The man I bought the ranch from. He was apparently short." "And the storage?" She stopped, looked at him. He was standing in the doorway of his kitchen, watching her assess it with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this and is trying not to show how much. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "Since November," he said. She looked at the kitchen again. She looked at the space it occupied, the light coming through the east window in the morning, the way the room connected to the rest of the house. She started, without intending to, doing the specific kind of calculating that she only did for problems she had already decided to solve. She caught herself doing it and stopped. "Caleb," she said. He came into the kitchen properly and stood near her, not too close, but the distance between them was the distance of people who had stopped pretending there was more of it than there was. "There's something I need to ask you," she said. "All right." She looked at him directly because she was not a person who said important things to the floor. "Is this what you're showing me today, this kitchen, this place? Is this you asking me something?" He held her gaze. "Yes. Say it then. Don't make me guess at it." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, she understood by now, just making sure he was going to say the real version and not a managed version. "I want you to come here," he said. "Not to visit, to stay. I want to marry you, Lydia." A pause. "And I want to completely understand if that's too much or too fast or not what you want. And I need you to know that whatever you say, I'm not going to stop being the person who comes on Thursdays." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, through the window, she was already mentally repositioning the oven away from. She could hear Frank doing something with the harness that was probably unnecessary, but gave him an excuse to be within earshot, which she had already factored in and decided not to address. She thought about what she had built on that hillside east of the creek. The dugout. The oven, first version and second. The kitchen that now stood beside it, wood-floored and glass-windowed and containing the best oven she had ever worked with. 3 years of winters survived. Bread enough to matter. She thought about her father's plan drawn on brown paper in Ohio. The imaginary fence lines. The future he had believed in and not lived to see. She thought about whether she had stayed in Nebraska because it was his plan or because it had become hers, and she knew the answer had shifted somewhere in the first year, and she had just never stopped to acknowledge it. She thought about the chair, how many times she had moved it and moved it back, how the moving it back had always been the braver choice, even when it didn't feel like it. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I'm not going to become a different person. I'm not going to stop having opinions about kitchen layouts and oven temperatures and whether the flour to salt ratio is right. I'm not going to stop being someone who needs to fix things herself first before she'll accept help. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm difficult to live with, probably. I've never done it, so I can't be certain, but I suspect it's true." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you be that person for 8 months, and I'm here asking anyway." "That's not a reassurance, that's just evidence," he said. "I know what I'm asking. I'm asking it on purpose." She looked at his face and found what she always found there. No performance, no careful management of impression. Just a man who was saying the thing he meant and waiting for her to respond to it. She had spent 3 years building things that were solid, walls that held, ovens that maintained heat, structures that did not collapse when the season turned hard. She had gotten very good at knowing, in her hands and her bones, when something was built right. This was built right. She had known it for a while. She had just been taking her time getting to the place where she could say so. "Yes," she said. He blinked, as if he had prepared himself, carefully, for the possibility of not yet, and yes had arrived before he was entirely expecting it. "Yes," he said. "I said yes, Caleb. Don't make me say it 3 times. He let out a breath she hadn't realized he'd been holding. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand, her flour-roughened, clay-stained, work-worn hand, and held it with the straightforward directness he brought to everything. Not romantic theater, but genuine contact. A person choosing another person. From outside, with implausible timing, Frank said loudly to no one in particular, "Well, it's about time." "Frank," Caleb said, "just doing harness work, boss." Lydia made a sound that she would later deny was a laugh. They were married in May, in the small manner of people who had no interest in spectacle and every interest in getting on with things. Marcus Webb stood up as a witness alongside Gunnar Lindqvist, who wore his best coat and said nothing during the ceremony, and afterwards shook Caleb's hand and told Lydia, in his economical way, that her father would have respected Hart, which was the most he had ever said to her in one sentence, and which she held carefully. Doris Halverson cried, which surprised everyone, including Doris. Frank ate 4 pieces of the wedding bread Lydia had baked that morning in the new kitchen, and told her it was the best thing he'd ever eaten, and then looked slightly alarmed by his own sentiment, which she found entirely charming. The wedding itself took about 30 minutes. The bread took 3 hours and was flawless. The move to the ranch happened over 2 weeks in June. There was more to move than Lydia had expected, not in volume, but in weight. Not the physical weight of her things, which were few enough, but the weight of leaving the dugout, which had been, for 3 years, the only thing between her and the full force of the Nebraska winter and the full force of being alone. She stood at the entrance on the last day, the door open, the small interior empty for the first time since she'd moved in, the cot gone, the shelves bare, the hooks on the wall naked, the oven cold. She had not expected to feel the particular thing she felt, which was not sadness exactly, more like completion. The recognition that something had been fully used, fully lived in, and was now finished in the way that good things finished. Not abandoned, not failed, but done. She had arrived here at 22 with a dead father's plan and a brother who had already left and a world that had contracted to the width of a wagon seat. She had carved a room out of a hillside and built a fire and made bread and figured out how to keep herself alive through 3 winters that asked everything of her. The woman standing at that door in June was not the woman who had moved in. Same hands, same stubbornness, same refusal to let things beat her. But the world had expanded again, slowly, carefully, through choices she had made one at a time. And the dugout had held her while it happened, and she was grateful to it in the specific, unsentimental way she was grateful to things that had done their job well. "Ready?" Caleb said from behind her. She turned around. He was standing with Chester at his feet and 2 of her boxes in his arms and the June sun at his back, and he was watching her with the patience she had come to understand was not strategy, but simply who he was. A man who had learned early that most things worth having required waiting and had made his peace with that long before he met her. "Yes," she said. She pulled the dugout door closed behind her and didn't look back at it because she didn't need to. It would be there. The hillside would hold it. The structure she had built with her own hands would outlast the weather because she had built it too. She took one of the boxes from Caleb's arms without asking, and they walked to the wagon together. The kitchen at the ranch was different by July. She had repositioned the oven within the first week, which required Frank and Dill and a fair amount of what Frank later described as creative language, but which produced a result that Lydia could work with properly for the first time. She had rebuilt the work surfaces at the correct height and reorganized the storage according to a logic that made sense to someone who actually used the space, rather than someone who had just needed somewhere to put things. Caleb had watched all of this without interfering, which she had not taken for granted. It was his house, his kitchen, technically. He could have had opinions about the reorganization, could have said something about the oven being moved, could have treated the space as belonging to him in the way that men often treated the spaces they owned. He didn't. He came in one morning in the second week and looked at what she'd done and said, "Better," and poured his own coffee and sat at the table, and that was the end of it. The bread operation grew that summer in ways that neither of them had entirely planned. Marcus Webb had been increasing his order incrementally since spring, and by August he was taking 8 loaves a week and had started asking about the rolls. The ones she had developed in January, the folded ones with the layered crumb, and whether she could produce them in quantity. She could. The new kitchen made it possible to run 2 bake cycles simultaneously, which had been impossible in the dugout. She did the math, adjusted the supply arrangement with Marcus, and by September was producing enough that the Mercantile had a regular bread display that people came in specifically for, which Marcus mentioned to her with the controlled satisfaction of a man trying not to admit he was pleased. The town's opinion, which had been divided through the winter and spring, had largely settled by fall into the particular resolution of communities that are proven wrong, quietly, without acknowledgement, through the simple mechanism of the thing they doubted becoming too established to doubt. Evelyn Marsh bought a loaf from the Mercantile in August. She mentioned to Martha Gaines that it was very good. Martha mentioned this to her husband. Her husband mentioned it at the barber shop. By the time it got back to Lydia through the chain of Harlan Creek's information network, it had been embellished considerably, but the core of it was accurate enough. Lydia said nothing about it to anyone and baked the next day's loaves the same way she always had. People's opinions of her had never been the variable she was trying to control. What she was trying to control always was the quality of the thing itself. This was the principle she had operated on since she first put her hands in dough at 15 years old in an Ohio farmhouse trying to figure out how to feed a household with less than the household needed. Quality was something you could actually manage. Quality was honest. It told you the truth about whether you were working hard enough and carefully enough, and it didn't care about your circumstances or your setbacks, or whether the season had been hard. She had built a life on that principle. She was building something larger on it now. There were hard days. There were mornings when the bread didn't come out right, and she knew exactly why. Distraction, a calculation error, fatigue from a night that had run too late. And she stood at the work surface looking at a substandard loaf and felt the familiar frustration of someone who held herself to a standard that didn't allow for much forgiveness. There were evenings when she and Caleb disagreed about things that mattered. The ranch's finances, a decision about the herd. Once a genuinely heated argument about whether to extend credit to a neighboring farmer whose operation was failing, where she thought yes and he thought no, and they were both right in different ways, and it took 3 days and 2 real conversations to work through it. There were mornings when she woke in the ranch house and reached for the old familiar heaviness of solitude and found it gone and felt. Instead of pure relief, a complicated edge of something she could only describe as the feeling of having put down a weight you'd carried so long, you didn't know how to stand without it. She told Caleb about that one evening, sitting on the porch in the September dark, with the air smelling of dry grass and the first suggestion of autumn coming. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I know that feeling. Do you? I built this ranch to have something solid, something that couldn't leave." He looked at the dark shape of the barn against the sky. After a while, I stopped noticing that I'd made something solid and just kept building, because building was what I knew how to do. He paused. "You changed that." She looked at him. "I didn't do anything." You made me want to show someone what I'd built. That's not a small thing." She thought about that, about the difference between building something and wanting someone to see it. How the wanting to show someone was its own thing, a different need than the building, one that admitted you weren't sufficient alone, that the work meant more when it meant something to more than one person. She had not thought of herself as someone who needed to be seen. She had been practical about that, the way she was practical about everything. You didn't need to be seen. You needed to survive, to produce, to maintain. But she thought now about the Thursday visits, about the specific satisfaction of pulling a good loaf and having someone in the room who understood what went into it. About the way Caleb had looked at the new kitchen oven that first day and said, "Well," and she had said it's right, and the knowing between them had been exact and complete. That was being seen, not performed for. Seen. She had been hungry for it without knowing the name of the hunger. Autumn came in the particular Nebraska way, decisive, unhesitant, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in a week and the sky doing that thing it did, that impossible blue of late September that made you understand why people stayed in places that were hard for them. Frank shot a turkey in October and Lydia cooked it in the new kitchen with a method she'd been developing, a clay-sealed roasting technique she'd adapted from the oven work. And it was imperfect in specific ways she made note of, and also the best meal anyone at that table could remember having, which Frank said out loud, and Dill confirmed with a single nod that carried considerable weight coming from him. Caleb caught her eye across the table and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and it didn't need anything said. By November, 1 year, almost exactly, from the first Thursday Caleb had ridden out to a dugout that no one else ever bothered to visit, Lydia stood at the window of the ranch house kitchen in the morning light and did what she did every morning. She looked at what she had to work with and planned the day. She had more to work with now, that was the simple fact of it. More space, more materials, more of everything that the work required. But the work itself was the same. Hands in dough, fire in the oven, the particular attention to what the bread needed on this day and this temperature with this flour from this season's harvest. She was good at her work. She had always been good at it. What had changed was not the skill but the context around it. The kitchen designed for what she actually did, the arrangement that let her produce more and better. The person who came in most mornings and poured his own coffee and talked to her about the ranch, and listened to her talk about bread ratios without his attention wandering. She had not known, 3 years ago, when she had moved into a hole in a hillside and built a fire and made her first bad loaf of bread in a clay oven she'd constructed mostly by instinct. She had not known that was the beginning of something. It had felt then like a last resort, like the smallest possible life she could fit herself into and still call it living. It turned out it was a foundation, not a perfect one. Foundations never were. The oven had cracked and she'd fixed it. The door had rotted and someone had helped her replace it. The structure had needed everything she had and more. And there had been days she'd been down to the last of what she had and hadn't been sure it was enough. But it had held. She had held. And the woman who had believed somewhere in the back of herself that the story of her life had already reached its permanent shape, that girl who carried a dead man's plan across the Missouri River and built something out of nothing and did not cry, that woman had been wrong about one thing. The story had not been ending. It had been waiting. Patiently, without sentimentality, the way good things wait, not for rescue, not for someone to fix what was broken, but for the specific accumulation of work and time and small, honest choices that eventually, if you kept making them, produce something worth having. The bread that Tuesday morning came out perfectly. Not always, not every loaf, not every day, but this one. The crust the color of honey, the crumb layered and even, the smell of it filling the kitchen the way warmth filled a room you'd been cold in for a long time. She put it on the work surface and looked at it for a moment. Then she cut 2 slices, put them on the table, and went to the doorway. "Caleb," she called. His voice came from somewhere near the barn. "Give me a minute." "The bread's ready." A pause. Then the sound of boots. He came in with mud on his hands and hay in his jacket, and the look of a man who had been up since before light doing the work that kept everything running. He sat down at the table and looked at the bread. He picked up a piece and ate it. She sat across from him and watched him eat it, and thought about a man who had once stopped in the middle of a cluttered mercantile because of a smell, and had stood there for 3 full seconds with everything else in the world going on around him, and had thought, who made this? That was where it had started. A loaf of bread and a question. Not a dramatic question. Not the kind that changed things in an instant. Just a small, persistent question that a man with good instincts had refused to stop asking until he had his answer. She thought there was something in that worth keeping. The idea that the things that mattered most sometimes began as a small, inexplicable pull towards something you couldn't name yet, and that the only way to find out what it was pulling you toward was to follow it, carefully and honestly, and without giving up when the road got difficult. The bread got eaten. The morning light moved across the table. Chester settled near the stove with the total commitment of an animal who had found his permanent place and was at peace with it. Caleb looked up and caught her looking at him. "Good bread," he said. "I know," she said. He smiled. The real one. The one that came without warning. And she held it in the way she had learned to hold the things she valued. Not tightly, not with the grip of someone afraid of losing, but with the open hands of someone who finally understood that the things built right didn't need to be clutched. They held themselves. Outside, the November prairie went on in every direction the way it always had. Flat and honest, and asking everything of whoever lived on it. The sky sat on top of it like a lid on a jar. Inside, the oven held its heat. The bread was done, and they were home.